In this video, I'll explore the fundamental factors that make an acid strong or weak. We'll begin our discussion by comparing methanol, CH3OH, to methane, CH4, with respect to acid strength. Methanol, it turns out, is a much stronger acid than methane. Acid strength is indicated by the pKa value. Remember, the smaller the pKa, the stronger the acid. The pKa of methanol is 15.5. The pKa of methane is 45. A big difference. Methanol's pKa is much smaller. But why is methanol a stronger acid than methane? Well, the strength of an acid can be judged by and is fundamentally determined by the stability of the conjugate base that it forms when it releases a proton. If the acid forms a more stable conjugate base, it will be a stronger acid, because if the conjugate base is more stable, the acid's compulsion to form that base will be greater. In other words, the acid will be stronger. So we have this: the greater the stability of the conjugate base, the stronger the acid that forms it. And that's fundamentally the way that we're going to make an assessment of the strength of an acid. We're not going to look so much at the acid itself, but rather we're going to look at the conjugate base that acid forms. All right, let's look in more detail at methane versus methanol as acids. Remember, methanol is a stronger acid. Here I've written equations for the proton dissociation of each acid, methane and methanol. The key now is to look at the conjugate base that each acid forms. Methane forms this conjugate base. It's called the methyl carbanion. There's a -1 charge on the carbon. Methanol forms this conjugate base. It's called methoxide ion. Notice there's a -1 charge on the oxygen. Well, the question is, which conjugate base is more stable? The key factor here turns out to be electronegativity. Both carbon and oxygen lie in the same row of the periodic table. And so, and we'll learn more about this later, electronegativity is the most important factor. Well, which is more electronegative, oxygen or carbon? If you look at the periodic table, the oxygen is more electronegative than carbon. If oxygen is more electronegative than carbon, it's better able to accommodate the negative charge than carbon. Therefore, O- is more stable than C-. The methoxide ion is more stable than the methyl carbanion. Thus, methoxide ion being a more stable conjugate base than the methyl carbanion, methanol is a stronger acid than methane. Now, let's look more generally and comprehensively at this idea. For our discussion, we'll assume that all acids are electrically neutral. Now, some acids may have a +1 charge. For acids that do, the thinking that will be used is similar but a little different. All right, the fundamental factor now that we're going to use to evaluate the strength of an acid is the stability of its conjugate base. Any factor that increases the stability of the conjugate base is going to increase the strength of that acid. It'll increase the compulsion of that acid to form the conjugate base. So understanding acid strength is all about understanding the factors that affect conjugate base stability. What we'll do is this. We'll start with some specific acid. We'll make a small change in its structure and see what impact that change makes on the stability of the acid's conjugate base. Now, there's two types of structural change that we'll make in the acid. Number one, the atom that's directly attached to the acidic proton will be replaced by a different atom. The different atom will either be a an atom of a different element or the same element but in a different state of hybridization. Right. The second type of structural change is this. An atom or group of atoms that's not directly attached to the acidic hydrogen will be replaced by a different atom or group of atoms. First, we'll look at category number 1, the structure change given by category 1. What we're going to change now is the atom that is directly bonded to the acidic proton. So we illustrate that in our little box here. We have this represents the general structure of our acid. A is the atom that's directly attached to the proton. The structure changes to replace A by a different atom. And the first instance here, this is subcategory A, the atom that we replace A by, B, will be a different element, but it will belong to the same row of the periodic table. So in our category 1A, the atom replacement, the atom that does replacing, will be in the same row of the periodic table. The important factor here is electronegativity, not the atomic radius. Let's look at an example. We ask the question, which is the stronger acid, water, H2O, or ammonia, NH3? Well, in order to assess this, we write the chemical equation for the dissociation of each acid. Water dissociates to give the conjugate base hydroxide ion. Ammonia dissociates to give the conjugate base, it's called amide ion. In order to decide which acid is stronger, it's simply a matter of looking at the conjugate base of each and deciding which one is more stable. All right? Which conjugate base is more stable, hydroxide ion or amide ion? Now remember, the important factor here is electronegativity. The substitution that we're doing is to, if we start with water, to replace the oxygen bearing the acidic proton by nitrogen. But both O and N, both oxygen and nitrogen, lie in the same row of the periodic table. And again, when that happens, electronegativity is our most important factor. Now, in order to decide then which conjugate base is more stable, well, we ask which is more electronegative. Oxygen is more electronegative than nitrogen. Now, oxygen being more electronegative, it's going to be better able to accommodate the negative charge. The hydroxide ion will thus be more stable than the amide ion. Because hydroxide ion is the more stable conjugate base, the water molecule that forms it is a stronger acid than the ammonia molecule. Water is a stronger acid than ammonia, therefore. All right, we next come to, this would be category 1B. All right, we're still replacing the atom that's directly attached to the acidic proton by a different atom, illustrated here in our diagram. Our starting acid, the atom bearing the acidic proton is E. The structural change will be to replace E by a different atom F. But in our subcategory B, E and F belong to the same column of the periodic table. In this instance, when the elements belong to the same column, the important factor is size, atomic radius, that is, and not electronegativity. That's the important point to remember. So we'll illustrate that with an example. This is would be category 1B. All right, which is the stronger acid, HF or HBr? We write the chemical equation for each acid dissociating. HF produces the conjugate base fluoride ion and a proton. The acid HBr dissociates to produce the conjugate base bromide ion and hydrogen ion. And now, to decide which acid is stronger, we look at the stability of the conjugate base as produced. Which conjugate base is more stable, fluoride ion or bromide ion? Well, again, remember, F and Br belong to the same column of the periodic table, and at instance, the important factor is the size of the atom, not the electronegativity. Of course, you remember that when you go down the column of a periodic table, the size of the atom increases, the atomic radius increases. Bromine lies below fluorine in the periodic table. Therefore, the bromine atom is larger than the fluorine atom. Bromide ion is a larger ion than fluoride ion. Well, important thing is this. Each ion has a -1 charge. It has the same charge, but because the bromine atom is larger, the negative -1 charge is dispersed over a larger volume in the bromide ion than it is in the smaller fluoride ion. The greater the dispersal of charge, the more spread out the charge it is, the more stable the species. We talked about that with what we called resonance stabilization. Because the bromide ion, being larger, it is more stable than the fluoride ion. And consequently, since bromide ion is the more stable conjugate base, the acid HBr that forms it is a stronger acid than HF. All right. Next, we'll look at a second subcategory under Category 1. We'll call this subcategory B. And in this subcategory, the structure change that we make will be as follows. We'll look at the atom directly attached to the acidic hydrogen, and we'll replace that atom by an atom of a different element. Now, both elements will belong to the same column of the periodic table. So in our model here, we start out with an acidic molecule where atom E is directly attached to the acidic hydrogen. We'll replace atom E by atom F. F is a different element, but both E and F belong to the same column of the periodic table. Now in this instance, when both elements belong to the same column, the important factor is the size, that is atomic radius, not electronegativity. All right, let's illustrate that with an example. We ask the question, which is the stronger acid, HF or HBr? In order to determine that, we write the chemical equation showing the dissociation of each acid. HF dissociates to produce the conjugate base fluoride ion and hydrogen ion. HBr dissociates to produce the conjugate base bromide ion and hydrogen ion. In order to decide which acid is stronger, again we look at the conjugate base formed by each. The acid that forms the more stable conjugate base will be the stronger acid. So the question now is, which conjugate base is more stable, the fluoride ion or the bromide ion? Now remember, the important thing here is both F and Br belong to the same in the same column. They belong to the halogen family. In this case, the important factor will be the size of the atom, not the electronegativity. Well, which is the larger atom? Bromine lies below fluorine in the periodic table. Therefore, bromine is a larger atom than fluorine. Consequently, then, the bromide ion is larger, has a larger volume than the fluoride ion. Now, both have a -1 charge. They have the same overall charge, but because the bromide ion is larger, the -1 charge is dispersed over a larger volume than the fluoride ion. Now, the greater the dispersal of charge, the greater the stability. That's something that we saw in the case of resonance, where we have so-called resonance stability. When there's dispersal or spreading out of charge, that will promote stability. Therefore, because bromide ion is larger and the charge in it is more spread out and dispersed, the bromide ion will be the more stable ion than fluoride ion. Bromide ion is the more stable conjugate base, and because of that, the acid HBr that forms it will be the stronger acid. HBr is a stronger acid than HF. Okay, now we'll look at a third category of category number 1. In this new subcategory, we replace the atom directly attached to the acidic hydrogen by an atom that's the same element but in a different state of hybridization. So in our diagram, we replace A, it's directly bonded to the proton, by A prime. A and A prime are of the same element, but they're in a different state of hybridization. The alkyne shown here turns out to be a stronger acid than ethane. Well, why? We can understand that if we look at the conjugate base that each one forms. Here's the conjugate base formed by the alkyne, and here's the conjugate base formed by the alkane. We need to look at is the hybridization of each hybridization of the carbon that bears a negative charge. So in the alkyne, the carbon bearing the negative charge is sp hybridized. The conjugate base formed by the alkane is sp3 hybridized. Now in the alkyne, the negative charge lies in an sp hybrid orbital. Because the sp hybrid orbital is shorter, the negative charge is closer to the nucleus, and that will make it more stable. In this conjugate base from the alkane, the negative charge is in a longer sp3 hybrid orbital. It's farther away from the positive nucleus and thus will be less stable. Because the alkyne conjugate base is more stable than the conjugate base from the alkane, the alkyne, the propyne, will be a stronger acid than the ethane. Now we come to a second category of structure change. Here we'll not change the atom that's directly bonded to the proton, but rather we'll change an atom or group of atoms more remote from that site. We'll change an atom or group of atoms that's not directly attached to the acidic hydrogen. Now, in a molecule, when an atom or group of atoms replaces another atom or group of atoms, we refer to this change as a substituent change. The atom or group that replaces the atom or group being replaced is called a substituent. The substituent will be linked to what I'll call the hotspot atom. The hotspot atom most critically determines the energy of the molecule pertinent to the issue at question. That is, whether we're talking about a chemical reaction or a physical property. In our discussion here, the hotspot atom is the negatively charged atom of the conjugate base. Now, the new substituent will either donate or withdraw electrons. It'll either donate electrons to the hotspot atom or withdraw electrons away from the hotspot atom. There are two types of substituent changes that come into play here. One's called the inductive effect, and the other is called the resonance effect. Now, in the inductive effect, in the electron withdrawal or donation process, if the transmission of electrons between substituent and the hotspot atom is through a chain of one or more sigma bonds, we say the substituent is an inductive effect. The other effect, called resonance effect, in the withdrawal or donation process, if the transmission of electrons between the substituent and the hotspot atom is through a chain of one or more pi bonds, we say the substituent effect is a resonance effect. All right, let's give an example of the inductive effect. Let's look at two different acids. This is called 2,2,2-trifluoroethanol. This molecule is ethanol. The 2,2,2-trifluoroethanol has 3 fluorines in this carbon. In ethanol, there's 3 hydrogens. So the substituent change we're making, we could think of starting with the ethanol molecule, and what we do is replace each of the hydrogens of the methyl group by fluorines. So our starting acid is the ethanol. We make our substituent change and end up with the fluorinated ethanol. Which of the two acids is the stronger acid? Well, that's indicated by the pKa value. Remember, the lower the pKa, the stronger the acid. The fluorinated ethanol has a pKa of 12.4. The ordinary ethanol has a pKa of 16. Well, obviously then, the fluorinated ethanol is a stronger acid. But we ask, why is the fluorinated ethanol a stronger acid? Well, in order to decide that, again, we apply the same principle. We do not look at the acid molecules themselves, but rather we look at the conjugate base that each acid forms, and that's shown in the next slide. This is the conjugate base formed by the fluorinated ethanol. This is the conjugate base formed by ethanol. Now the key here is this. We have replaced the hydrogens of ethanol by fluorines. Now fluorine is more electronegative than hydrogen. Because of its greater electronegativity, each fluorine atom is going to pull more strongly on the negative charge on the oxygen in the conjugate base. That's going to cause a considerable portion of the negative charge in the oxygen to be transmitted through these two sigma bonds and end up on the fluorine atoms. A fraction of the negative charge is pulled away from the oxygen and will pile up on each of the fluorines. We'll stand back and look at the result. Some of the charge remains in the oxygens, but a good fraction ends up on each of the fluorines. The overall -1 charge, you see, is fairly markedly dispersed over the entire molecule. In the conjugate base from ethanol, the -1 charge resides completely and solely on the oxygen. Here the charge is not dispersed. Well, charge dispersal is a stabilizing effect because a fluorinated ethanol conjugate base is more charge dispersed. It's going to be more stable. In the conjugate base from ethanol, the negative charge is locked and painfully residing on just the single oxygen. It's very localized, very energy raising, very painful for the oxygen. Because the conjugate base for the fluorinated ethanol is more stable, the acid that forms it will be stronger. Now the second kind of substituent effect for category 2 is called the resonance effect. Now in this case, the electron withdrawal or donation is going to be through a chain of one or more pi bonds. Let's take a look. Right, we're going to compare the acid strength of acetic acid with ethanol. If we ask which is the stronger acid, well, the answer, of course, is given by the pKa value. Acetic acid has a pKa of 4.74 and ethanol is 16. Acetic acid's pKa being lower, that means acetic acid is the stronger acid. Now the value of the pKa just tells you which is the stronger, which is weaker. It does not explain which acid is the stronger acid. In order to in order to explain it, we have to look more deeply. And of course, what we're going to do is going to look at the conjugate base that each acid forms. The acid that forms the more stable conjugate base will be the stronger acid. So I've drawn here structures of the conjugate base respectively formed by acetic acid and formed by ethanol. Let's decide which is more stable. Well, for the ethanol, that was one we'd seen before. That was rather high energy. The negative charge localized entirely on the oxygen. That's energy raising, and so forth. But now, in acetic acid, what we've done structurally is to replace the CH2, this group of atoms, by a carbon-oxygen double bond, a carbonyl group. As a result, in the conjugate base, we introduce new resonance structures. The conjugate base form, or the conjugate base derived from acetic acid, we can draw two resonance structures. When you can draw resonance structures, that means that the species has delocalization of electrons and charge. You can't draw resonance structures for the conjugate base from ethanol. It's pretty much stuck. But in acetic acid, it has two resonance structures that we can draw, and that tells us that the conjugate base of acetic acid has resonance stability. Resonance stability is a important and very large type of stability. This resonance effect stability is in fact much larger than inductive stabilization in general. Because of the greater stability of the conjugate base from acetic acid, it means that acetic acid will be the stronger acid. The acid forming this more stable conjugate base, one with resonance stability, will be stronger. Just an additional word on the term resonance effect. We can look at resonance effect like this. The charge starts out as a negative charge on the oxygen that was originally attached to the hydrogen, shown here. But because of resonance, there is a drift of charge from this oxygen to the oxygen of the carbonyl group. If you look at the single dotted line structure here, you can see that the electrons that are transmitted from the original oxygen to the carbonyl oxygen are through these two pi bonds, actually 2 pi bonds of bond order 1/2. The carbonyl oxygen has withdrawn electrons through these 2 pi bonds, and when electrons are donated or withdrawn through a chain of pi bonds, we term that a resonance effect. Now, the simplest way to identify resonance effect when it occurs, this is our category number 2, where we replace an atom or group of atoms not directly attached to acidic hydrogen. Well, is this. If the substituent change creates new resonance structures that weren't originally present, we will have our resonance effect. And in general, resonance effect is a bigger effect than an inductive effect.